Okay, now we'll get to the stuff that this particular unit is going to have more questions about. And that is what's called trophic structure. Troph is a food and eating kind of word. So this is about what eats what, feeding relationships, right? We have this idea of a food chain, first proposed by the father of modern ecology, whose name I forget. His name starts with a P. Um, but here we have the classic idea of a food chain. And we have these therefore called trophic levels, which we identify with these words. And somewhere along the line here, you're going to see in the IB syllabus, they want you to use these terms when describing this kind of food chain, as opposed to these terms, carnivore and herbivore. Even though they kind of expect you to know what that means, they want you to use this. What's the word produce mean? It means you can produce organic molecules. Which ones produce them first? Primary means first here. The ones that can do photosynthesis, or maybe chemosynthesis, but most of the time it's photosynthesis, right? So what's the first kind of thing to eat them? The primary consumers. They eat plants and algae, the photosynthesizers. If you eat a primary consumer, you're a secondary consumer. So this is pretty easy number-wise, right? But here is a big factor here. What are these things, inadvertently, passing on to the next level, both chemicals and energy? What's the second law say about energy? You can't ever get what you pay for, right? There's always an energy loss at each energy transfer. That energy loss is mostly in the form of heat. We'll come back to this in a minute. And that is why these food chains are rarely longer than 5 organisms long, because there's just not enough energy to stretch out the energy in the bottom levels, the primary producers, to 10 or 12 different levels that are feeding, all traced back to it. So, using one of these examples, we'll explain how the stability of populations, communities, and ecosystems, that's 3 different levels, is affected by interactions with abiotic and biotic factors. We are going to focus a lot on this one, and that diversity is good. There's different kinds of diversity. We're going to break this down later, so just right now. Species diversity means in your community, in your ecosystem, how many communities do you have? Or excuse me, how many species do you have in your community? The more the better. The more diversity, the better. Okay. So we'll get to all these things and we'll work them in. So here's your classic food web. What is a food web? Well, it's just a whole bunch of interconnected food chains. And this says that, right? A food web shows all the possible food chains in a community. And this says that most species occupy different trophic levels in multiple food chains in a food web. What's that mean? Well, let's answer these questions, because they want you to be able to do this skill. Just as a reminder, the red stuff is in the SL IB syllabus. The green stuff is in the HL IB syllabus, but it's stuff you should know anyway. So I'm not going to differentiate between these two so much. So if you look at this, which one or ones are the producers? Well, you might typically look to the bottom here because they're called the bottom of the food chain, right? However, in a diagram, they don't have to be on the bottom. So if instead of actual names that you might recognize, or you might not in this case, phytoplankton means plant-like little creatures, that means they're producers, right? And a picture of them, like this is a shrimp, it's obviously not a plant, it's a producer or an algae or whatever, right? If they have like A, B, C, D here and ask you which are the producers, what are you looking for? The ones who don't have any arrows pointing to it from some other creature, right? What the arrows represent here are once again 2 things, both energy in the form of chemical bond energy and nutrients, chemicals themselves, are going from this organism to that one. How? When this one eats that one, right? So that's what the arrows mean. So the autotrophs, and there's only one here, just these, the autotrophs are the things in a diagram like this that don't have any arrows pointing to it, only arrows pointing away. So now back to this thing, occupying different trophic levels in multiple food chains in the same food web. So which one of these is a primary consumer only? Well, you only have one producer. The primary consumers eat the producers. So I know it's getting squiggly here, but these shrimp eat plankton. They're a primary consumer. Ooh, but look, they also eat these guys. And so in eating those guys, that makes them a 1, 2 secondary consumer, occupying different trophic levels in multiple food chains. This is the only one of all these. This is the only one that only eats plants. So it's the only one that's only a primary consumer. And again, they might just ask you straight out to identify these. On the IB test, they ask you much more one-word answer questions than they do on the AP test. So what we're going to talk about a lot here is what happens if one of those things goes away in that food web. What happens if one of them number decreases for whatever reason? Maybe humans capture too many of them, overfishing. Maybe there's a disease that reduces their numbers, right? So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to also, again, emphasize that if you have fewer kinds of populations, species, little diversity, that makes you less resilient to change in the environment, and that means more likely to become extinct. That's why diversity is good in this big Jenga game that we call a food web in an ecosystem. Okay, so now it says here that in maintaining the diversity of this ecosystem, things called keystone species, the producers quite obviously are important, and then essential abiotic and biotic factors. Abiotic factors we're still going to ignore for a little while, but like sunshine is obviously a key. So here we go with a little bit of that practice. Dominant species. None of the, neither the AP or IB syllabus has this term dominant species in it, but if they define it for you, it's simply the ones that there are the most of, dominant species, or have the highest biomass. Usually that's the same, right? These are usually the producers. If they're removed or their numbers are dropped tremendously, this ecosystem has a problem because, again, it's the bottom of the food chain. And if you take the bottom out, the top collapses. This kind of change, for that reason, is called bottom-up regulation. What's one thing that regulates the number of wolves in an ecosystem? You got to start with the plants in that ecosystem. Because if rabbits eat the plants and wolves eat the rabbits, then the plants go down, the wolves are going to go down. It's like also a big game of dominoes. When the dominoes fall, the dominoes start to fall and bump into other dominoes. So that's kind of this idea. So here we have that term keystone species, and here you see this is the IB syllabus. That specific term is in here, so if they use it, they expect you to know what it is. This is the classic experiment which led to that term, actually. And what you have here is a starfish. Aster is the star word. Aster is the star word. The guy's name is on the next slide that did this particular study. He goes up and down the shore of, this is in the Northwest, like Oregon or Washington, and he sees all these interacting kind of things in this ecosystem, and he says, I wonder what happens if I take the starfish away. Kind of like a knockout experiment that we described before, right? What if I take the starfish away? Let me sit back and watch what happens. Well, here's what happens if this species diversity is your dependent variable. What's it depend on? Well, it depends on time going by, but what it really depended on are two groups. Our control group, where he just left it naturally with the starfish, and our experimental group when he saw what would happen if he took them away, right? Where you clearly see the number of species drop pretty dramatically in the span of 3 years. you go from about 18 different species in this little ecosystem to like, that's probably 2 species. That means these exert an important regulating effect on other species in the community, the ones at the top predators, the wolves is going to be a classic story in places like Yellowstone National Park. This kind of regulation is called top down. What happens if something knocks these guys out, like an experimenter picking them up? It starts the dominoes to falling to affect all the ones below it in this case. Okay, so this was Robert Payne in Washington and elsewhere. Um, and what we have here, just on a bigger scale, this is much like the negative feedback systems that we see at work in a single organism like ourselves. Remember, what happens when your blood sugar goes up? Well, that triggers the release of insulin. That causes your blood sugar to go back down. What's that cause your blood sugar to do as time goes by? Stay kind of steady. What did these balancing systems in a big ecosystem cause? The number of species usually to stay about relatively the same. So this is just a very large scale negative feedback system. If something increases or decreases, mechanisms are triggered to take that in the opposite direction. Here's a classic, another just real fast example. Here we have with killer whales, top of the food chain, therefore keystone species. Without killer whales, and this is good because this just tests your analytical ability. They love these kind of questions in EOC tests and AP tests and things. So we have both graphs, 3 different kinds, right? We got the number per square meter, or actually per quarter of a square meter, right, of these algae, plant-like producers. We have things that eat them, measured in grams per quarter square meter. And then we have the actual number of otters. So we have 3 different dependent variables, but they all mean how many of these things are there, right? And then we have arrows that are fatter or skinnier. That means a lot of this is being eaten by that. Why is a lot of this being eaten by that? Because there's a lot of this. We have a bar graph that also represents like the arrows. What we have is if there's a lot of these eating a lot of this, that keeps the numbers of these low. But if something makes the numbers of these low, which is lots of the things that eat them, then that means these guys can go to town. If you have few of these, you have more of the things that they eat. That way, sorry. Why would we have lots of otters? Because we took away the thing that they eat. This is top-down regulation again. Okay, so we're going to finish this because we're going to come back to that kind of concept in the next unit also. It's all interconnected, which is the idea of an ecosystem in general. This succession idea. This succession means as time goes by, which kind of species might replace others, succeed others, just like leaders succeed each other, so to speak, and you call them successors. So we have 2, in my mind, very unnecessary adjectives here. We have what's called primary succession and, secondary, I guess is coming up on the next slide. Primary succession is defined by a place where there's not soil. Well, that place where there's not soil might be the same place where there was soil back in time. So a key aspect of this succession is when do you choose to start your story? If I want to start my story right here about this particular place, and this particular place just had a volcanic eruption, and so all this lava covered the whole place, and then it cooled and hardened, and it's just bare rock with no soil. If I start my story at that point and tell the story about what living things then start to come and live there, that's called primary succession. Okay? Lifeless, good luck with finding a place that's lifeless, because every place we humans have tested on the planet Earth, we have found prokaryotic cells. As far as we've ever dug deep, And as high as we've ever gone into the atmosphere, we have found little prokaryotic cells. So lifeless is with, like an asterisk or with those quotation marks around it. Okay, so when is the other situation where you might have bare rock? After a glacier scrapes it bare and then melts away, which we're seeing a lot of now, right? What kind of things might first live there? Well, they got to be things that don't need soil, and these are the two kinds of things. Mosses are plants, lichens are classic symbiotic relationship things, and algae and a fungus. I think we touched on them before, right? Those things, because they are the first colonizers in this area, are often called pioneer communities, and they then start a common theme here. They are going to change the environment. And as they change it, that makes it possible for other things to live there. So a big change that they make is because of chemicals they secrete start to break the rock down. Mechanical weathering, like wind and water, also break the rock down, and eventually you get some soil. And if you have some soil, what can you have? Well, after a while, you can have plants. And then you can have taller plants. Why do taller plants often replace shorter plants? The competition for sunlight, right? Being taller is better. And so this is the typical pattern we see in succession. We'll come back to that in a minute. If the place you are talking about, from the time you start to tell its story, which again is a key, is a place where most of the life has been cleared away, how is that? Well, it might be bulldozed, right, by an actual bulldozer. So like a vacant lot that still has dirt, so it's not primary succession, but you took away most of the things that were living there, or very often naturally a fire, okay? You've killed most of the living things there. There's still things living in the soil, but you do have soil, right? So this is called secondary succession for no great reason, right? Just the difference is there soil at the start of your story? Secondary succession is your story. Is there no soil? Primary succession is your story. So then here is a common little graphic. This is not one area. This is not one area where over here you don't have tall things and over here you do. This is time going by in the same area. So here you have again the pioneer community of lichens and mosses creating soil so that little things can start to grow, right? And then the seeds get blown by the wind or taken in by animals, and sometimes seeds of trees come, and then you have taller things start to grow, and then you have even taller ones grow until there aren't any taller kinds of things around. Sometimes that's called a climax community, but that's pretty subjective because if the volcano erupts tomorrow and all this gets covered by lava, or if the fire comes, now we're going to start our story over again, even though it's the same area of land. So you can see how these stories are kind of subjective. Okay. Anyway, that's the end of this one.